Hi. Okay, so we're going to look at the cognitive approach, and this presentation is going to help you understand the AO1 of this approach, which will be looking at the general assumptions. And you have also got to be able to evaluate it, which is the AO3. And hopefully, I'll be able to help you understand how you can make your life a bit easier with the evaluation. So, it would be useful if you have your textbook with you, open at 130 to 31. However, that's not necessary if you haven't got it. But what would be more important is if you have got pen and paper and also your cognitive approach booklet at page 45. And this then goes all the way up to page 53. If you haven't got pen and paper or your booklet, I would pause this presentation now so you are unable to go and fetch. Right, okay, here we go. Let's get started. Okay, so you have your timeline for the assumptions, and as you can see, that the cognitive approach, although actually relatively quite old, is more recent, being developed in the 1960s. So it developed as a direct contrast to the behaviourist approach, which you would have studied previously. So what I want you to think about is what did the behavioural approach ignore with regard to our human experience? Trying to explain human behaviour, what does the behavioural approach ignore? All right, just have a little thinking time. Okay, your answer is coming up, and it should be fairly clear to you that the behaviorists call the approach behaviorist approach because they only look at behavior. In other words, they ignore any internal cognitive processes. So let's just think about the word cognitive approach. Now, the word cognition means knowing. So, a cognitive process is any process that helps you know about the world. For example, memory. If you don't have a memory, then there's no way you are going to know anything about the world. And the behaviorists, they ignore this because they suggest that you can't observe these internal cognitive processes. And if you can't observe them, then you can't measure them objectively. So they reject the idea of internal cognitive processes. In fact, they think that we are passive in our responses to environmental stimuli because we don't think about how to respond, we just respond in a conditioned way. Okay. Whereas the cognitive approach argues that internal cognitive processes should be studied scientifically because we're not passive, because we actively respond to our environment. We think about our responses and we think about the stimulus that we have just been given from the environment so we can manipulate information received. Now, let's just have a little look at what we mean by cognitive processes. It means, one interpretation of this is that it means that our human mind works like a computer. So you get input from the senses, which you can store, and then you will have a response, which is your output in the form of how you behave. So this is referred to often as the information processing approach. So let's have a little look at what could be interpreted as information processing. Okay, so first of all, how do you experience the world? Well, you will experience the world through how you perceive your environment. And perception means the interpretation of sensory information. So the information will go through your five senses, and your brain will then interpret what those sensations mean. So if something's hot or cold, okay. Attention Have you paid attention? So, were you watching something? Did you not hear something? Therefore, you didn't give it your attention. Okay. So, how do you solve problems? Well, that's going to be through the how you make your decisions, how you weigh up making decisions through your thought processes. And you are going to need to store information and recall information, and that's going to be through your memory. And also, you need to communicate. So that's going to be through language. Okay, right. So let's look at the main assumptions of the cognitive approach. There are 4, and you have to know every single one of these. Okay, so we're going to take each one at a time. Okay, so you're clear on all of them. So the first one is the scientific study of internal mental or cognitive processes. And there is an example here that you are going to need to be aware of and be able to describe. And the example is called inference. So we're going to look at this before we go on to 2, 3, and 4. Right, okay, so we're looking at the first assumption. And if we think that all these internal mental processes can influence our behavior, for example, your memories will influence how you behave, it is going to therefore be important to study them. Okay. But how can you study these? Right. Okay. They're mainly studied in two ways, 2 techniques, 2 research methods. Okay. So the first method is by experimentation. So you could, for example, conduct a memory experiment under very strictly controlled conditions. And for example, you could investigate whether the information that you are given in one environment, if you then have to recall that information in a different environment, did the change of environment affect the accuracy of recall? Okay. So what you are changing is the environment. Work out what the DV is. It is the accuracy of the recall. Right. Okay. So another type of investigation used for the cognitive approach are case studies. For example, there was a chap called HN who had epilepsy, and he had an operation to cure his epilepsy. It went slightly wrong, and they took out slightly too much of the hippocampus, and it affected his memory. So consequently, he then developed amnesia. Okay, so that's the type of case study that you could look at because it was directly related to memory. Right, let's go back to inference. Now, if any of you have got pets and your pet tries to tell you and communicate to you, okay, by your dog going to get its lead or your cat pointing at its bowl, then you can assume that either your dog wants to go for a walk or that your cat is telling you that it's hungry. So just by looking at your cat or your dog's behavior, you are assuming how it is feeling. So you are inferring what is actually going on and whether the cat is hungry or the dog wants to go for a walk. Now, we make these assumptions and inferences all the time about how other people are feeling or what they're thinking. Okay? And half the time you will be responding to other people's communication to you by making the inference of how that person is feeling or what they are thinking. Now, sometimes it's really difficult and you're just looking at somebody and you're thinking, oh, I really don't know what they're thinking. So sometimes you just have to ask them, what are you thinking? Okay, here are some notes that you could take down and they would be added to page 46. So what I would suggest you do is you pause this presentation and that you read and highlight the text on page 46, which takes you down to exam question number 1. And once you have done that, then you can take these notes down and they then get inserted at page 46. Now, this is saying that some internal cognitive processes are private, like thought. So you can't actually directly observe somebody else's thinking. So you will observe them indirectly because you make assumptions, inferences about what is going on inside their heads. And you think that that is reflected in their behavior. So you observe their behavior and you make assumptions about how they are actually thinking. Right, I'll leave you to pause to read page 46 and take your notes now, and I'll carry on with the presentation. So come back to it when you are ready to do so. Right, these notes are continued, and that's just saying that these cognitive processes can be studied scientifically in the lab by inferring the actions of the mind from observing somebody else's behavior and measuring their behavior. So these cognitive processes therefore help you explain somebody's behavior. So how somebody is thinking will therefore help explain why they behaved in that particular way. Right, okay, this is in the box on page 46. It's not split up, but you might find it easier to split what's in the box into the 3 points on this slide. Okay, so inference is the act of drawing a conclusion from evidence, in other words, somebody's behavior, and you are looking for clues when you look at somebody's behavior, their non-verbal communication, their speech, to build up what you think is going on in terms of their mind, which you cannot observe directly. And this is then going to be informed by a theoretical model, which will then help give you some evidence into making up your mind as to how you could explain their behavior. We're coming on to theoretical models in a minute, so don't worry too much about that. So just read that on page 46. If it's easy for you to split it into 3 points, do, and just highlight as you can. As you can see, some of it's already in bold. Right, okay. Looking at page 46, you can see exam question number 2. We'll come back to number 1 later. I would suggest that you have a go at this exam question, and you'll see that it goes over onto page 47 for the exact question. Now, this is AO2 because it is the application of your understanding of what inference is to the scenario. So give yourself some time to read through the question clearly. If you need to underline what's important, then do, and then give yourself some time to have a go at the question, and your teacher will then go through the various answers with the exam questions at a later date in class. So again, I'll leave you to press pause now, and I'll move on. Right, okay, so we are now on to our second assumption of the cognitive approach. What is a schema? What is meant by a schema? Now, you will find this on page 48 of your booklet. And what I would do is I would just read the top of page 48, okay, and then highlight that it helps to organize and interpret information. And then you can put this in the box, that schemas are a cognitive framework that help organize and interpret information in the brain and help us predict what is going on and what happens in new situations. Okay. So this, what is on the slide here is actually on page 48. Again, it's bullet pointed. I've just numbered it. You've got 4 points here. I would highlight this, and you need to be aware that this is explaining to you why a schema is useful. And you need to be aware of why they are useful, because that could easily come up as an exam question. All right. So basically, every hour you are bombarded with a huge amount of information. Okay, so think about that on a daily basis. And consequently, you need to be able to take shortcuts. So you make stereotypes, and that's basically a shortcut. And it's like you will exclude anything that doesn't conform to your pre established ideas. And you will focus on facts that actually do fit with your expectations. Okay. So consequently, they allow you to fill in a gap. So you know what to expect. So the world becomes a bit more predictable. Often, when you get like photocopying, sometimes the very last word of the sentence is missing just because it hasn't been photocopied very well. But knowing what you expect the word to be allows you to fill in the gap. So that will make reading that sentence predictable. Okay. Now, you're going to need to take notes on the next 5 slides. Okay, they relate to AO3, evaluation of schema. Your booklet mentions Bartlett, Frederick Bartlett. Okay, now your teacher may go through Frederick Bartlett's study. However, I've got a very easy study for you here by Brewer. And the reason why you can use this is because it is research evidence, okay, that supports the role of schema as a cognitive process which affects the accuracy of memory. Okay, and it was done in 81. So the research demonstrated that if you have a schema driven expectation of the presence of a certain object, then that might actually affect the accuracy of your recall of whether the object was there or not. Right, let's have a little look at the study. Here we go, by Brewer and Trans, and you can go Brewer et al. And it's basically a very simple experiment of memory of objects in a room. Okay, and it's to investigate whether people's memory for objects which was in a room in an office, it was actually in an academic's office, all right, within a university, is influenced by expected and existing schemas about what you expect would be in an academic's office. So the procedure was they had a sample of 30 participants who were all university students. They arrived individually to the lab, and they were then asked before the study that they thought they were doing. All right, they were asked to wait in an office individually. Okay, and in this academic environment of the office, it contained objects like a desk and a typewriter and a coffee pot, etc., just as you would expect within an academic's office. But it also had objects that didn't conform to the office. So it had a skull, a pair of pliers, and a piece of tree bark. And after waiting for some time, the participants were taken out of the office and they were asked to write down everything they could accurately recall from the room. So it's very straightforward, very simple. The results were that most of the participants recalled what they expected, the expected objects that would fit in with their schema, the desk and a typewriter. Some participants reported things that they expected to be in the office but weren't actually present, like a phone and books. So you'd expect those to be in an academic's office, but they had been obviously on purpose removed. Okay. Many participants also recalled the skull. Now that doesn't fit in to schema theory, but it's probably because it was so unexpected that it took people's attention. Okay. So generally, people accurately recalled the chair, the desk. They also recalled the skull. Okay. However, 30% of the participants falsely remembered the books. As you can see, there were no books. Okay. So a number of the participants recalled having seen books in the study, whereas none were present. So they concluded that the participants' expectations that books are present in academic studies were enough to prevent their accurate recollection of the office that they had been spending time in. Now then, how are you going to use this as evaluation? How are you going to use this study for schema? And I want you to think about, how would you tail an AO3 point concerning this study? Again, just take some time out, have a think about it, write a sentence or two down if it comes to mind. And if you want to pause that now, then do, and I'm going to give you the answer. So basically, how you would tail this is that Brewer et al.'s findings support the role of schema-driven expectation affecting the accuracy of the internal mental process of memory, which suggests that the cognitive model is a useful approach to explain behavior. Okay. Now, another point of Easy AO3 is to evaluate that study. And here you need to know and understand the term, research methods term, mundane realism. So if the task doesn't reflect real life, then you could argue that the task lacks mundane realism. So you could argue that Brewer et al.'s study uses artificial test materials which you don't really use in everyday life, like random objects in an office. So consequently, you could argue that maybe you can't generalize Brewer's findings to real life situations, because their findings lack mundane realism, because the task fails to reflect behaviours that would occur in real life settings. So consequently, how strongly Brewer's Brewer's et al.'s findings support the cognitive approach can be questioned. Okay, try a very simple question now. This is on page 46. It's worth 2 marks. Now you've got an idea of internal mental processes. Okay, and you have got examples of 2. You've got inference and you've got schemas. You can go back and have a go at that particular one. As I mentioned before, try to answer all your exam questions. And this is the experience of trying to improve your exam technique besides your understanding of the content. So your teacher will help you with the answers, and they can then check your exam techniques. Right, okay, so you can pause your presentation now, have a go at that one, and I'll carry on. Right, we're on to assumption 3, our penultimate one, and this is the idea of the use of theoretical and computer models to explain and make inferences about mental cognitive processes. So here you are going to need to read and highlight the paragraph at the bottom of page 48, and when you have done that, you will then need to turn to page 49, and you will see a box which has MSM in it, which stands for multi-store model. And you'll need to draw the diagram, which comes up on the next slide, in that box. And here we go. There we are. Now, this is the multi-store model, and it is a theoretical representation of what your memory looks like. So you can see it's made up of boxes and arrows, and it suggests that information flows in a direction. So from the environment, it enters sensory memory, and you pay attention to this, what's coming in through. So it will then enter your short-term memory. Okay. And you can then rehearse that information as to several times, keep rehearsing that information, and if you do it enough, it will then get passed on to your long-term memory. And you can then retrieve information from your long-term memory. Now, memory is a topic that you will be doing later in the course, and Your teacher will therefore help you clarify this particular theoretical model of what your memory looks like. Okay, but what you can see is if you actually put sections of your memory into theoretical boxes, you could perhaps test your short-term memory, okay, individually distinctively from long-term memory. Okay, so this will allow us to look at specific parts within a model. Right, okay, let's move on. Now then, don't worry about the internal working model or the working model of memory, which is what you've got there, WMM on page 49, because that will be covered when you do memory. So when you do memory, as it is a cognitive process, you could revisit this approach and you could use this as a revision exercise. And once you've done the working memory model in memory, come back and fill in page 49, see if you can remember it. Okay, so you are going to need to be able to describe theoretical models. So I would take down these 3 points and include them at page 49. And they are basically saying that theoretical models are used to describe, they are representing and explaining internal mental cognitive processes, and they are a simplified representation, and they are based on research. So yes, there is research on short-term memory, and yes, there is research on long-term memory, and they're often pictorial in nature, represented by boxes and arrows, which indicates cause and effect of the stages, so you could see the direction that they go. Okay, so as you saw with the multi-store model, you've got boxes for STM, boxes for LTM, and the arrows show the flow of information. So these models enable you to consider how the brain processes information by just thinking in terms of different structures and what each one of them does. So you don't think of memory as one big whole memory. You break it down into individual boxes. Okay, now then, got a warning here. Okay, all right, you've got to remember that you could get a question on theoretical models or computer models, or you could get one on both, okay, because both of them are on your spec. So we do also have to do computer models. Right, this is fairly straightforward. A computer model sees your mind as a computer, okay? So it's the idea that this is on page 47, okay, and you'll see that you've got there a paragraph about this at the bottom. So I would make a point of reading that and highlighting that. Okay, but basically, it's very similar to a computer because you input information into the brain. You then store information and you process information in the brain. And then the output is actually where you like behave, and you can retrieve information from the brain because that would then going to tell you how to behave. So it's input, store, process, output. Right, so basically your computer essentially codes information. It's going to change information, okay? And that's going to be how you have perceived it, how you think about it, okay? So it comes in from the sensory information, you will then process the information, and then you will then store it in the form of perception, memories, behaviors, and that will then inform your output, which will be your behavior. Okay. So a brief description, this will go at the bottom of page 47, but it's basically saying that the cognitive approach has also used the development of computers to create computer models of our cognitive processing. Okay. So computer models refer to programs that can imitate the mind. So why bother? Why bother? It means that if you can do this, you can test whether their ideas about our information processing are correct. Okay. And it's also helped with trying to understand how we code or change information as it passes through the system. Right, okay, so quick question before I give you the answer. I want you to think about a cognitive, the model in terms of, is our brain like a computer? What's the difference between how we process information and how a computer processes information? All right, is there a difference? What do you think? You've got a 50-50 chance here. It's either yes or no. Is there a difference? Okay, the answer is yes. There is a big difference, actually, in terms of how a computer works and how our brain works. And it really relates to human error. So, computers are not renowned for making mistakes, whereas us humans, we are, after all, only human, we can make mistakes. So, consequently, computers don't make mistakes. They don't ignore available information because it just doesn't fit with their schema, or they don't forget particular pieces of information which have been stored on their hard drives, whereas we do. Our memories are very fragile. Okay, it's not like a photograph; it's our interpretation of what we saw. So, consequently, we are going to be influenced by certain aspects. So, our memory is not necessarily going to be accurate. So, therefore, we can make mistakes. But computers, they're slightly more accurate than we are. Now, this relates to a point of AO3. This is on page 51, and it relates to the idea of machine reductionism. So I think I would suggest that you fill out that box on page 51 on machine reductionism. Okay, and you will also find that that is on page 52 under the IDA evaluation points. It's the third one down, and that will help you understand machine reductionism, IDA, issues, debates, and alternative approaches. Okay, right, I'll leave you to do that, and you can pause this presentation and I'll push on to the next one. Okay, you are now ready to practice your exam technique and have another go at a different exam question. You will find that this is on page 50. Okay, so have a go at that. There's a hint there for you on how you could attack this 2-mark question. And once you've done that one, you could move on to the bottom exam question, which is where you are asked to match the key terms on the left with the definitions on the right. Okay. And again, when you've done this, you can get your work checked by your teacher. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the final assumption, which is the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. Now, this is actually very fashionable. This is where a lot of money is being pumped into cognitive neuroscience at the moment. You will find that you could now go on to do degrees in neuroscience. A good university for this is Manchester. They've got a very good reputation for their degree in neuroscience. And it's basically trying to understand your cognitive processes by using brain scans. So you can, because you can't actually see directly how a person thinks just by looking at them, you put them in a brain scanner and you can actually see what is going on in their brain, which is then going to help you understand what is going on internally. Okay, so this is actually emerged as a new area of research. Okay, so what is it in a nutshell? It is the scientific study of how different areas of the brain are involved in cognitive mental processes, e.g., memory. Okay, you don't necessarily need both words, mental and cognitive. I keep using the word cognitive processes because it is the cognitive approach. Right. So there are various brain scanning techniques. Okay. And you could have a brain scan using the fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonance image. And basically, it is looking at parts of the brain and it's looking at the functions of the brain while you are doing different behaviors within the brain scanner. So you could be recalling information, and then what is demonstrated is that different areas of the brain are activated. So there's a more oxygenated blood to that area because it's working harder when recalling episodic memories. Okay, that's memories of your past, for example, and present, rather than procedural memories, would be like, how do you do things? Okay. A procedure is remembering how to walk, how to ride a bike, how to swim. Okay. An episodic memory is, could you remember what you did on your birthday last year? Right. So you can see that now your brain is responsible. Different parts of your brain is responsible for different activities. This is what it looks like. It's huge. Okay. You will often, some of you may have gone for an MRI scan. That's actually looking at the structure. So an fMRI looks at the structure and the function. Okay. And it's looking at the brain activity by detecting changes associated with blood flow. As I said, oxygenated or non-oxygenated blood flow. And the harder the brain is working, the more oxygenated blood will show up on the brain scan. It involves what you can see in the image, and it has a very, very heavy magnet which weighs up to about 11 tons. Okay. So when you do psychopathology later in the course, you have to look at the biological explanation of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So let's have a little look at OCD. What happens when somebody with OCD goes into a brain scanner? Okay. Well, what they have found is that there is an imbalance in certain neurotransmitters. So there's high levels of dopamine and low levels of serotonin. Okay. And therefore, they are implicated, and it is assumed that they are implicated with the explanation of obsessive compulsive disorder. And this imbalance of neurotransmitters may therefore explain why people have this thoughts that they cannot ignore. So their thoughts are that they have to obsessively wash because their thoughts are telling them they have to wash because they are unclean. Therefore, they have to get clean. And they can't ignore these thoughts. And the reason why they can't is because there is an imbalance within these neurotransmitters. So, consequently, the neuroscience here can help explain what is going on internally, those cognitive processes. You can't ignore those cognitive processes. Right, okay, so we've just got to finish off with some evaluation, and you could fill out. There are 2 points that I would suggest that you fill out. A positive is that it uses the scientific method, so it's scientific, it's objective, empirical, okay, and that uses controlled lab studies. So that's a positive. It's also got real world practical application, as you will see in the top left hand box on page 51, which has been filled out for you. Okay, and that is that it's helped us understand perhaps why people have certain disorders like depression, and consequently we can then perhaps help people with depression by trying to understand and help them rethink the situation. Okay, so let's have a little recap. So for your AO1, you've got 4 assumptions and you have to know each of those assumptions, okay? With your AO3, you only really need 3 to 4 points of AO3. And one suggested is that you use Brewer's study to support research evidence to support schema affecting the accuracy of memory. Therefore, it supports the cognitive approach as a useful approach to explain internal processes, cognitive processes, and behavior. And you can evaluate that particular study. Okay, that's a further point of AO3. Obviously, that therefore questions quite how strongly Brewer's study can be used to support the role of schema, questioning perhaps quite how useful this particular approach is. The scientific method is a positive, as is the practical application. And we have also looked at the role of human error. So perhaps the idea of explaining your cognitive processes with the analogy of a computer model, maybe that's limited. So that's a negative. Okay, one. You have got another AO 3 point in the table on page 51, and you can fill that out if you wish. With it ignores emotion and motivation, but remember, really, you only do need, I would say, 4 points of AO3, make them really well elaborated, make your AO3 effective, and therefore, consequently, you can always cut information down from the textbook. But you must go by what your teacher is wanting you to do. All right, okay, that was the cognitive approach. Your teacher will help you through this particular approach and will pick up the assumptions and help you with your AO3. Okay, folks, that's all. Okay.